Hey guys, today I'll show you a fantasy horror thriller TV series named Night Visions, Part 2. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The 14th story begins with a woman, Ashley, noticing a community notice in her daughter's school bag after she came home from school. Although she didn't mention anything to her daughter, the message deeply troubled her. After dinner, she approached her husband to express her concerns. The notice stated that a male sex offender had been targeting young female students in the area, and despite a month-long search, he had not been caught. The husband tried to reassure her, suggesting that the offender might be from a different community, but Ashley pointed out the notice was sent to their own community. She urged her husband to come up with a plan. As they discussed the situation, there was a knock at the door. When Ashley opened it, she found their close neighbors, two couples who were equally anxious, holding the same notice. The group gathered to discuss the situation, agreeing that since the offender hadn't been caught, there was a high chance he might target their neighborhood next. They decided to form a neighborhood watch, patrolling the area more frequently and reminding their children not to talk to strangers. It seemed the only preventive measure they could take. The next day, Ashley and her daughter spotted a suspicious man lurking around the children's play area, seemingly watching the kids. When they got home, Ashley called her husband to report what she had seen. But during the call, her daughter hurried out and ended up sharing the elevator with the man. Ashley rushed down the stairs, only to find her daughter safe in the basement level. Her daughter reassured her that the man hadn't done anything, but Ashley couldn't shake her suspicions. She recognized the man with the buzz cut. That evening, Ashley shared her concerns with the neighborhood watch. The group discussed it and noted that the man with the buzz cut was a veteran and currently unemployed. Since moving into their building, he had always been silent and uncommunicative when they met. This led everyone to suspect that he might be the criminal. In response, the husband and two other male neighbors decided to go to the underground parking garage and vandalize the man's car with a hammer, sending a warning. Later that night, after playing with friends at a neighbor's house, Ashley's daughter was about to take the elevator home, but remembered her mother's warning not to ride the elevator alone, especially because of the mysterious man with the buzz cut. So she decided to sneak back home by climbing through the neighbor's window. However, as soon as she entered, she realized she was in the man's apartment. She watched in horror as he picked up a knife and began searching for something. Her mother's warnings seemed true. He was dangerous. Though terrified, the little girl managed to stay calm. She waited for the man to go into the kitchen before making her escape out the window. Just as she was about to make it out, the man grabbed her, tearing her clothes. When she finally made it home, crying and distressed, Ashley and her husband immediately called the police. The police arrived and, after questioning the man, sat down with the couple to explain the situation, saying that there's no need to be so angry and it's impossible to detain him. The truth is, their daughter trespassed into his private property. They should consider themselves lucky that he's not pressing charges against them. With that, the police left, leaving the couple to reflect on the situation. That night, the husband couldn't sleep. He discussed the situation with his two neighbors, who were equally agitated. One of them asked him if he had seen how tragic those cases are where parents lose their children. The pain they go through is unbearable. As members of the neighborhood watch, they hinted at something more sinister, saying they would back him up afterward and they would be his witnesses. The implication to the husband was clear. After some thought, the husband decided to take matters into his own hands. The next night, armed with a gun, he found the buzz-cut man smoking in the park and shot him dead. When the police investigated the scene, the neighbors stuck to their story, feigning ignorance. They all claimed to have been asleep, only awakened by what they thought was a truck backfiring, and went out to investigate. With everyone sticking to this story, it seemed likely that the case would remain unsolved. A week later, the husband returned home from work in a good mood and gave his wife a kiss. But he noticed something was wrong. Ashley seemed distant, as if something terrible had happened. She handed him a new community notice, and her husband froze as he read it. The sex offender had finally been caught, and the community was now safe. It dawned on the husband that he had killed an innocent man. Now he would have to live with that guilt for the rest of his life. The 15th story begins with a man, Shane, was busy washing his family's horse when two of his friends started gossiping about the old man, Jack, in the distance. They said that Jack is a loner and a murderer, while his mother was a witch. They teased Shane that he wouldn't dare go to Jack's farm. Shane didn't pay much attention to the first part, dismissing it as his friends trying to stir up trouble. After all, just because an old man lived alone didn't make him a killer. But their challenge got under his skin. The next morning, Shane stood hesitantly at the edge of the fence, eyeing the no trespassing signs. Despite the warnings, he summoned the courage to enter Jack's farm. As he approached the buildings, he noticed Jack digging a hole. Unfortunately for Shane, Jack noticed him too and turned around, catching him red-handed. Not knowing what kind of man Jack was, Shane panicked and ran for his shitty life. But Jack, despite his old age, was determined to catch the intruder and gave chase running fast like a Tesla bike. As fate would have it, during the pursuit, Jack accidentally stepped on a button that activated the combine harvester. In his haste, he tripped and fell into the rotating blades, which mangled his arms. A week later, after being released from the hospital, Jack, now armless, showed up at Shane's house. Shane's worst fear was realized. Jack had come for revenge. But to his surprise, Jack spoke sincerely to Shane's father, saying he lost his arms, but he was not here for revenge. He just wanted to be reasonable. Even though it was an accident, it's harvest season, and without his arms, he couldn't work. So he suggested that Shane should come over to help out for the next 2 weeks. Shane's father quickly made Shane apologize for trespassing and agreed to have Shane work at Jack's farm. For the next 2 weeks, Shane dutifully performed basic tasks on Jack's farm. Though he occasionally worried that Jack might seek revenge while he worked, nothing of the sort happened. In fact, on the last evening, Jack even paid Shane a few $100s for his help, expressing his gratitude. Shane thought that everything had been settled fairly, but then something unexpected happened. A foal was born in their family's stable, but it had no hind legs. Shane's parents tried to reassure him, saying it was just a rare biological occurrence and nothing to worry about. The horse could be bred again. They even tried to comfort Shane by telling him that his mother was pregnant and that he would soon have a little brother or sister. From a distance, Jack smiled knowingly, leaving Shane to wonder if this was all part of Jack's revenge. Perhaps Jack's plan was only just beginning. The 16th story begins with a young girl, Julia, along with her parents and younger brother, deciding to take a trip to a countryside resort. Even though they had been there for several days and were enjoying the peaceful, secluded environment, Julia's dissatisfaction with her family began to surface. Let's break it down. Her clueless brother always tattled to their mom, constantly spewing nonsense. Her mom favored her brother over her, and as for her dad, he was bald and loved his drinks a bit too much. Sometimes after a single comment from mom, he'd get all cowardly. In Julia's eyes, it might have been her teenage rebellious phase, but she found her family utterly unbearable. She preferred to be alone, recording her thoughts about the world and watching a handsome neighbor tidying up the area. Watching him lifted her spirits, and Julia had secretly admired him for quite a while. The next day, Julia dressed up nicely, leaving a slight opening in her top to appear more attractive. Julia wanted to introduce herself to the handsome guy, but as she approached, he ignored her sexy body and walked right through her before disappearing. Shocked, Julia hurried home and told her family what she had seen. She explained that a handsome guy walked through her and then vanished without a trace of his smelly hormones. She claimed the guy might be a ghost. Her family, however, dismissed her bullshits. They teased her, saying that they had never seen any handsome guy and accusing her of daydreaming from reading too many novels, clearly annoyed by her story. Julia realized her family wasn't just skeptical, they were outright disdainful. Frustrated, she returned to her room to record her thoughts once more. Suddenly, she heard a noise and looked up. There he was again, the handsome guy. Upon closer inspection, it seemed she was indeed imagining things. The man seemed to exist in another world, separate from hers. Perhaps she had stared at him for so long that her consciousness reached him, or maybe he had heard her voice. He looked in her direction, seeming to notice her, but sadly shook his head and ran away, vanishing once more. The next morning, Julia saw the handsome guy again through the window, busy downstairs. She rushed down to find the parked car had a ghostly overlay, as if from the previous night's scene. They were living in different spaces, parallel universes perhaps. As the man started his car to leave, Julia opened the door and climbed inside. This time, she knew better. She stayed silent, enjoying watching him smoke, but she couldn't help herself. She touched his face. The man reacted as if he had seen a ghost, losing control and causing an accident. Crawling out of the car, he cursed why the ghosts kept bothering him, and he was just here to clean up. Hearing this, Julia fled back to the vacation house in panic. When she opened the door, she was met with a startling scene. Most of the house was in ruins, charred beyond recognition. She followed the debris to the living room. The mother saw Julia, her face covered in burn scars. Her mother explained she told her not to disturb the janitor. He would get scared when he saw her since they all died in that fire a week ago. She urged her daughter not to keep disrupting the balance between their world and the living world. This twist was quite something. It turns out a week earlier, Julia and her family had perished in a tragic fire at the resort. Yet their souls continued to live on in a parallel realm. In essence, they were all ghosts. No wonder the guy was terrified when he saw Julia. In the end, Julia accepted her mother's words, deciding to let go of her fantasies about the man. When she opened her eyes again, her family was back to living quietly in the vacation home. The 17th story begins with a man named Barry, who was cornered in the street by a loan shark and given a brutal beating. The loan shark made it clear that he had already extended Barry's payment deadline several times and that tonight he wanted his money. Realizing the man wouldn't let it go, Barry seized an opportunity, grabbed a bottle, and fought back. As his assailant hit the ground, Barry made a run for it. He was lucky enough to run into a woman named Amanda, who was driving by after work. Barry jumped into her car despite her protestations. When she saw the men chasing him, Amanda decided it was best to avoid further trouble and sped off. Noticing Amanda's attire, Barry asked if she was a nurse. She replied no, and she worked at a pet hospital. Barry asked if she could help him with his bleeding wounds. After hesitating for a moment, Amanda agreed, as helping others is a source of happiness. Amanda took Barry to her home. As they entered, her 2 dogs enthusiastically greeted them. Amanda explained that she had adopted them a while back. While tending to Barry's wounds, she asked about Barry's job. Barry replied he was a musician. It's tough living as an artist, and he had been wandering for quite some time. He thanked Amanda for her help, saying now that he was patched up, he would be on his way. But as Barry stood up to leave, the dogs whimpered, as if asking Amanda to let him stay. However, Barry insisted on leaving. Being too weak, he swayed and almost fell. Amanda caught him, and the closeness sparked a moment. Barry leaned in to tongue massage Amanda, but she stopped him. Embarrassed, Barry apologized, and Amanda suggested he rest for the night before leaving. Barry spent the night on her couch. The following morning, Barry woke to a pleasant surprise. Amanda had gone out and, using the address from his wallet, retrieved his guitar. Up to this point, it seemed like fate had brought them together, hinting at a budding romance. However, the story took a bizarre turn. Barry was grateful to have his guitar back and agreed to stay a couple more days to recover fully. That night, Barry noticed through the window that the loan shark had returned, probably due to Amanda retrieving the guitar earlier. As the man tried to climb in through the window, Barry, who had bonded with the dogs during the day, gave them a command. They launched at the intruder, biting him viciously. To Barry's shock, the dogs killed the loan shark. When Amanda returned home, Barry explained what happened, and they considered calling the police. But Amanda, petting her dogs in tears, then she buried the body in the yard. Barry hesitated, saying it didn't feel right, but Amanda insisted that calling the police was a bad idea. They might not believe them, and could take her dogs away or even accuse them of murder. Reluctantly, Barry agreed, and they buried the body together. Later that night, Barry decided to leave but couldn't find Amanda. While searching the house, the dogs unexpectedly attacked him. Barry fell down the stairs and lost consciousness. When he woke up, Amanda informed him that he had broken his ankle and she bandaged him up. She then asked him to stay a few more days before leaving for work. Barry noticed she had taken his phone. He tried to get up, only to find one of the dogs standing on the phone, seemingly guarding it. As Barry attempted to retrieve it, the dog growled menacingly. He went downstairs, but another dog blocked his path. Realizing he was trapped, Barry tried to open the door, but the dogs wouldn't let him. Returning to his room, he accidentally provoked the dogs again, who started attacking him. Barry managed to escape into the bathroom and lock the door. Just as the dogs broke in to maul him, Amanda returned and stopped them. Barry, now desperate, tried to confront Amanda, but she spoke first, asking if he was mistreating her dogs. She thought her dogs helped Barry with his problem and that they could be a family. But since Barry didn't want that, she would have to take a different approach. Amanda then commanded the dogs to attack and injected Barry with something. When he awoke, he found himself chained by the neck and hands, locked in the basement. It turned out Amanda's plan was to keep Barry like a pet. Too late, Barry realized his mistake and regretted everything. The 18th story begins with a housewife, Kate, who had just seen her daughter off on the school bus and was feeling relieved when she turned around and bumped into a tall man. She apologized, but to her shock, the man grabbed her and started to assault her. Kate screamed for help as the man, who had apparently come prepared, pulled out a rope and tried to strangle her, dragging her along the ground. Luckily, the rope snapped and the man fled. Shaken by the encounter, Kate called the police. When they arrived, she recounted the incident as best as she could, although it all happened so fast. The police promised to follow up, and her husband comforted her as best he could, using words only but not muscles. The next day, Kate went shopping at the supermarket when a stranger struck up a conversation, insisting she should buy some snacks. Initially, she responded politely, not thinking much of it. However, the man suddenly grabbed her shopping cart and refused to let go, telling her she wasn't going anywhere and that he was going to take her away. Panicked, Kate knocked over the snacks, and when she turned around, the man had vanished. Perhaps still shaken from the previous day's attack, she wondered if she had imagined it. Trying to calm down, Kate later visited her salon for a hair treatment. She usually saw the hair lady who regularly did her hair and asked for her. However, a female employee told Kate that the hair lady was on vacation and she would be helping her instead. Figuring that a wash is a wash, Kate lay back and chatted about how she had been having a streak of bad luck, even joking that sometimes she felt like dying would be easier. To her horror, the stylist replied that he could help with that and began spraying her face with water furiously. Fortunately, Kate managed to get up and escape, finding a police officer outside to explain what had happened. The officer saved Kate from the situation. After experiencing 3 attacks, whether or not the supermarket incident was imaginary, Kate realized that both the initial assault and the stylist's attack had been very real. Later, the police came to Kate's house and warned her husband to ensure his wife's safety. After they left, her husband suggested maybe they should go to the hospital to check on her. Kate resisted, exclaiming she was not sick and why she should go to the hospital. The ones who attacked her are the ones who need to be caught and treated. She promised her husband that she would stay home and avoid trouble. As soon as he left, however, she received a call from a man who threatened to take her away. Recognizing the voice from the supermarket, Kate realized she hadn't imagined the incident. She tried to explain that he must have mistaken her for someone else, but the man hung up. The next day, while driving, Kate fiddled with the radio but couldn't find any stations. Confused, she looked down briefly, and when she looked up, it was too late. Her car crashed into a utility pole. When she came to, she found herself in an ambulance. To her shock, the supermarket man and the salon stylist were her paramedics. Without a second thought, Kate jumped out and ran home. She wondered if they had orchestrated the accident. Back home, she locked the doors and armed herself with a knife, determined to fight back. Just then, she heard the sound of a heart monitor coming from the bedroom. Curiosity got the better of her, and she went in. There, she saw a shocking sight, herself lying in a hospital bed. A doctor checked her vitals and said she should pull through. It turned out that everything from the start of the story until now had been Kate's imagination as she lay in a coma. No one had attacked her. Through the doctor's conversations, the real story emerged. Kate had had a violent argument with her ex-husband, during which she killed him and her daughter in a fit of rage. Attempting to take her own life, she had tried to hang herself but was discovered and saved by a neighbor at the last minute. She had been in a hospital bed ever since. In reality, Kate didn't have a loving husband. It was all in her head. Her imagined attackers were actually the doctors, nurses, and security guards in the hospital room. Subconsciously, Kate's mind had cast them as her attackers, representing the pain her ex-husband had caused her. Finally, as a nurse prepared to administer her medication, Kate suddenly grabbed a stand and knocked the nurse out, injecting herself with a lethal dose. Perhaps she had long since lost any will to stay in the real world. Kate then drifted into the fantasy world she had created in her mind. The 19th story begins with a man, Andy, heading to work when he was talking to his girlfriend on the phone. Just after he hung up, he accidentally bumped into a pedestrian. Looking up, he realized he had spilled his drink all over the other person, covering their clothes and face. The man was clearly unhappy, and Andy quickly apologized. Despite this, the man didn't seem inclined to forgive him. He shouted, then said in Russian that from now on, everyone would hate him. With that, the man walked away, leaving Andy feeling unsettled. At a restaurant later, Andy recounted the incident to a friend who initially tried to reassure him, asking him not to let it bother him. But then, a waitress interrupted harshly, telling Andy to finish his meal and pay up quickly. His friend suddenly seemed to switch sides, agreeing with the waitress and urging Andy to pay up, since he was the one who ran into the guy. Confused by his friend's change in attitude, Andy went to work, where he sat down for a meeting only to be confronted by his boss. His boss said this is his 3rd time being late in 2 years, giving him a final warning. Andy apologized, but his boss seemed fed up, announcing that 3 strikes were enough for him to get fired. Andy tried to smile it off, not quite believing what he heard, which only infuriated his boss more. Feeling wronged and with everyone watching, Andy packed his things and left. Andy called his girlfriend to update her, but as he was talking, a construction worker nearby started shouting at him like a madman, asking him to watch where he was going. Embarrassed, Andy apologized, saying he didn't notice, but the worker hit Andy with a shovel, knocking him to the ground. As if that wasn't enough, the other workers picked up their tools and attacked him too. They shouted that saying sorry isn't enough, advancing with their equipment. In the nick of time, Andy managed to kick the plug out of one of their tools, giving him a chance to escape. Breathless, he found a police officer on the street and explained everything, saying those construction workers tried to kill him, but he didn't do anything to them. But the officer wasn't interested, suggesting that Andy had wandered into their sight and caused his own problems. Trying to reason with the officer, Andy noticed that the policeman had drawn his gun, preparing to accuse Andy of assaulting an officer. Feeling abandoned, Andy wandered into a bookstore to catch his breath. As he watched an author being interviewed on TV, everything suddenly made sense. The author was promoting his best-selling novel, which featured a plot where the main character was cursed, causing everyone who met him to hate him. Andy realized that his situation mirrored that of the protagonist. The Russian man's words must have been a curse. Buying the author's book, Andy read through it on his way home. But then, a mysterious biker tried to run him over. Fortunately, the biker missed, and Andy made it home. Desperate to talk things over with his girlfriend, Andy tried to explain the day's events, starting with getting fired. She seemed impatient, cutting him off and telling him to shut up his smelly mouth. When Andy grabbed her arm, trying to explain that he might be cursed, she pulled a gun and pointed it at his head, demanding him to get out of her house since she had wanted to break up with him for ages. As she aimed to shoot, Andy wrestled for the gun, and in the struggle, she accidentally shot herself. Staring at the author's book, Andy felt himself slipping into madness, blaming the novel for triggering all these events. Eventually, Andy broke into the author's home. The author, hearing the commotion, discreetly hit an alarm button. Andy's demands were bizarre. He wanted the author to rewrite the novel, removing the curse entirely. The author agreed, trying to placate Andy and buy time until the police arrived. Peering out the window, Andy saw the cops approaching and remembered what happened to his girlfriend. Certain that the blame would fall on him and feeling that everyone hated him, Andy ended his life in despair. The next evening, after chatting with friends at a bar, the author was leaving when he found a crumpled piece of paper on his car's hood. Opening it, he read an excerpt from another novel saying that on a quiet night, the protagonist checks the trunk and is ambushed by a journalist. Alarmed, he looked up just as an old journalist approached and attacked him. This twist ending was as bizarre as the story itself. The 20th story begins with Harlow receiving a plane ticket and a letter while at work. The letter informed him that his uncle, whom he hadn't been in contact with for a long time, had unexpectedly passed away at home. Harlow quickly packed and flew to his uncle's old mansion. Harlow explained to the lawyer that he had almost no contact with his uncle due to the long distance between them. The lawyer succinctly got to the point that Harlow was his uncle's only living relative. According to his will, he was to inherit his mansion, along with all his other assets and funds. Harlow couldn't believe his luck. An unexpected fortune had fallen into his lap. One might expect Harlow to call some friends over and throw wild parties in the mansion, living a life of luxury. However, things soon began to feel off. Entering the house, Harlow noticed that every light on the first and second floors was on. The lawyer explained that Harlow's uncle was probably afraid of the dark. Taking the keys, Harlow mused about owning such a vast place. After giving Harlow a quick tour and showing him a small room his uncle used to store light fixtures, the lawyer mentioned that Harlow's uncle had a servant who had discovered his uncle's death. He added that if Harlow wanted to continue employing the servant, he would need to pay her. With that, the lawyer departed. Harlow showered and got ready for bed. When he opened a drawer, he was startled to find a dead mouse inside. Perhaps the house was just old. Harlow wasn't too bothered by it. The next day, Harlow called an electrician to examine the house's wiring and set up a master switch to control all the lights. There were simply too many to handle individually. While working, the electrician commented that since he was planning to donate this mansion to the town, why he was doing all this. This irritated Harlow, who replied he had never said that. After the electrician left, Harlow called the lawyer over and confronted him that he was spreading false rumors. He knew this mansion was allegedly built with the townspeople's blood and tears. Apparently, his uncle had some conflicts with them, and now they want this mansion. He added that as the only family heir, he finally felt he had some value in life and the responsibility to take care of this mansion. So he told the lawyer to stop telling people he plans to donate it to the town. It's not happening. After sending the lawyer away, Harlow prepared for bed. Just as he was about to turn off the lights, it hit him that there was a reason for the dead mouse and for why his uncle had so many lights. A strange shadow in the room had swallowed and killed the mouse. Perhaps this shadow was afraid of the light, which is why his uncle kept so many lamps. Recalling the lawyer's words, it seemed that the mansion was haunted by the vengeful spirits of townspeople who had died building it. Coincidentally, the servant arrived to clean, and Harlow shared his suspicions, asking if she knew how his uncle died and what's up with this shadow in the house. At the mention of shadow, the servant was so frightened that she refused to clean and ran out, saying these shadows were afraid of the light. That's all she could tell him. With that, she left without a trace of her smell. Just as Harlow was heading upstairs to sleep, he heard a buzzing sound. Upon inspection, he found a light bulb with a loose connection. He went to the small room to grab a new bulb. As he installed it, one of the bulbs exploded, casting a shadow on the desk. This confirmed the servant's warning. The shadow was indeed afraid of the light. With the problem identified, Harlow devised a solution since he planned to live there long term. He went to the pet store and bought a lot of birds, placing their cages throughout the first and second floors. He connected the cages with large pipes and installed massive floodlights at the end of the pipes, ready for action. Harlow planned to use the birds chirping to attract the shadow, then use the floodlights to destroy it. The first part of the plan worked perfectly. That night, Harlow turned off all the house lights with a remote. Mistaking the bird calls for mice, the shadow was lured into the pipes. Harlow was excited to get the shadow. Pressing a button, the floodlights overwhelmed the shadow. From the sounds, it seemed the shadow was vanquished inside the pipes. Standing up and looking at his uncle's photo, Harlow declared that they finally chased those townspeople away. At that moment, shadows on the wall suddenly gathered and covered Harlow's face. He urgently shone a light on himself to drive the shadows away. Although he temporarily repelled the shadow, Harlow was now made blind. After all this, it turns out that living in such a haunted house isn't worth it. The 21st story takes place in March 2001. On this day, a young college student named Susan was jogging on the track when her classmate Wes caught up with her and tried to chat her up. He invited her to a party or out on a date. Honestly, Susan found Wes quite handsome and polite, but due to her current stage in life, Susan preferred to be alone and was a bit socially anxious. So, she turned him down. The next morning, on her way to class, Susan saw Wes talking to some classmates not far off. To avoid the awkwardness, she ducked into a maze made of hedge walls. Taking a longer route would waste a bit of time, but at least she wouldn't have to face him. After wandering through the maze and finally finding her way out, Susan walked toward the cafeteria, reading a book and paying little attention to her surroundings. When she reached the cafeteria, she was puzzled. The normally bustling place, filled with chatting students, was completely empty. Outside was deserted too. Instinctively, Susan pulled out her phone, extended the antenna but found no signal. After wandering around campus in a panic, Susan became anxious. It was winter, and April Fool's Day was far away, so where had everyone gone? Then she heard music coming from the music classroom. Following the sound, Susan entered the room and was relieved to find her music teacher, who asked if she had signed in. Feeling relieved to finally see someone, Susan glanced around and saw several classmates slumped in their chairs, lifeless and with eyes wide open. Seeing the teacher's demeanor shift from polite to aggressive, Susan was forced into a chair. She kicked her away and quickly ran off. Returning to the cafeteria, Susan checked the date on the board and understood what had happened. She had accidentally traveled 2 years into the future to March 2003. But despite the time travel, she wondered where everyone had gone. Armed with a knife to defend herself against potential attackers, Susan headed to the library, hoping to find some answers. While browsing, Wes suddenly appeared from behind a bookshelf, the same classmate who had tried to ask her out. He joked that no need to grab a knife just because she turned him down for a date. Susan asked him where everyone was, and Wes explained the newspapers have all the answers. Susan read that a series of asteroid impacts had begun hitting Earth 5 months ago, with more than a dozen occurring since. Wes added that nearly 90% of people felt going to school or work was pointless and had gone into hiding. Some had even committed suicide or turned to crime, and in the past few months, the world had become a complete mess. Wes reminisced about his freshman year when he was always chasing Susan on the track. If he could turn back time, he would hope she would say yes to a date with him. Now, with the world ending, maybe they would be together if she had. But Susan was too preoccupied to engage with him, pondering if she had traveled through time when she left the maze. As they spoke, a noise startled them. Susan turned to see a mysterious figure with a knife attack Wes. It was the deranged music teacher again. Fleeing from her, Susan held up a newspaper and argued with the teacher, asking if she saw Judgment Day and breaking the law didn't mean she would escape punishment since God sees everything. The sound of air raid sirens accompanied her words, making the teacher pause, drop the knife, and leave. The siren likely meant another asteroid was about to hit Earth. Susan hurriedly dragged the wounded Wes away and reached the maze's center. Wes, gravely injured, collapsed and whispered he hoped he would get to know her in his next life. With that, he succumbed to his injuries. Just then, the weather changed dramatically. The sky turned red with clouds and thunder. Susan saw shadowy figures near the maze's exit. At the last moment, she made it out and found herself back in 2001, surrounded by familiar classmates and settings. The shift in time and space had returned everything to normal. This brief time travel experience gave Susan much to think about. Lying in bed, she decided to start over and put her social anxiety behind her. After all, 2 years later, the world might end again. Determined, Susan sought out Wes and boldly agreed to go on a date with him. The 22nd story begins with a man named Pete who was traveling when his car suddenly broke down. Fortunately, he noticed a road sign for a place called Harmony Town up ahead. True to its name, the town seemed incredibly peaceful. After briefly chatting with a sexy woman, Pete explained his situation. The sexy woman was very helpful and said she would call a mechanic to tow his car and get it fixed. Pete was grateful. After inspecting the car with the mechanic, he learned that the issue wasn't major, but a part needed to be bought from the next town over. The mechanic suggested Pete stay in Harmony Town for a couple of days. The inn the mechanic recommended was nice, though Pete was surprised that there was no TV. The innkeeper explained she didn't like noise, so they didn't have TVs or radios. Pete didn't mind. Everything was peaceful and pleasant so far, and at $3 a night, it was a great deal. As the innkeeper left, Pete started whistling in high spirits. Suddenly, the innkeeper stormed back in, her demeanor changing abruptly. She yelled for him to stop the whistling. Startled, Pete apologized and promised to stop. The next day, Pete took a walk to the outskirts of town and stumbled upon a funeral. There he met the sexy woman again, who introduced her brother Tim. She explained that the funeral was for a mother who had lost her son, which was why she was so distraught. Unexpectedly, Tim added that the said mother's only mistake was staying in Harmony Town. That night, as Pete was sleeping in his room at the inn, Tim climbed in through the window, startling him. Tim urged Pete to stay quiet and warned him to leave this town immediately. Curious, Pete asked why he should leave since everything seems fine here. Tim insisted the people here were crazy. They would band together and take him out. At the funeral today, he overheard 2 villagers saying that the boy didn't die accidentally from a fall down the stairs. In fact, the boy's mother strangled him because he was listening to music while doing his homework. Tim insisted that he was not lying, asking Pete if he had noticed how sensitive the town was to sound and if he had seen any TVs or radios. Just as Tim finished speaking, they heard the innkeeper approaching. Tim quickly left, and Pete, pretending to talk to himself, assured the innkeeper that he was alone. Later, Pete took a flashlight and went to investigate the cemetery. Tim's words seemed true. The tombstones indicated that most of the deceased were teenagers aged 12 to 17. Suddenly, Pete heard someone crying. Turning, he saw the mother from the funeral holding a gun, contemplating suicide. She believed that her son was taken by a demon from the town. Unsure whom to believe, Pete pondered whether the mother or Tim was right. While he was lost in thought, the mother pulled the trigger, ending her life. Stunned, Pete looked around and saw a group of people with flashlights chasing Tim. As Pete was about to intervene, the mechanic arrived with his repaired car, saying that the car was ready and he should leave now. Seeing the police and villagers surrounding Tim, Pete stepped in to help like a hero. The police held up a record, and Pete acknowledged it's his. The sexy woman added that her brother stole it from his room, breaking the town's rules. Confused, Pete asked about the rules. The villagers explained that there's a beast here. If it gets disturbed, it'll destroy them all. So for generations, they had protected this rule. Anyone who breaks it by playing music or singing must die. As someone who valued freedom, Pete felt compelled to argue with the villagers, saying there can't be a beast and that music brings them joy and makes life better. Maybe they just fear losing authority, so they suppress kids who play music. As Pete spoke, the villagers restrained him. In desperation, Pete began singing a gentle song, hoping to awaken the villagers to reason. The villagers listened in silence, hearing only the sound of insects rather than any beasts. Realizing the truth, the sexy woman joined in the song and embraced her brother. As the atmosphere shifted, other villagers attempted to overcome their fears and joined in the song Pete had started. But then, as the villagers finished the song and prepared to return home, a massive, glowing creature appeared, roaring loudly enough to shatter car headlights and windows. The villagers panicked and fled for their shitty lives, but the beast attacked, taking everyone with it. The 23rd story begins with Mark, the security officer on a large cargo ship, hearing strange sounds resembling human voices while doing his routine inspection of the containers. Concerned, Mark reported the situation to the supervisor and captain, expressing his suspicion that they might have stowaways in the containers. Although the old captain didn't say much, the supervisor laughed and said he probably just heard the wind and told him not to take it too seriously. Feigning agreement, Mark pretended to go along with the supervisor and captain. However, he decided to investigate further, using a sound detection device near the containers. As soon as he started, the device alarmed, and Mark suddenly bumped into the supervisor. Mark insisted they need to be thorough. If there are stowaways, they could lose their jobs. The supervisor was irritated. He shoved Mark against the wall, ready to get physical. Luckily, the captain's voice came over the PA system, and the supervisor, muttering angrily, walked away. As Mark was about to check another area, he heard someone behind him cry for help. Turning back, he followed the voice to a container and peered inside. There he found a group of stowaways, including a woman who pleaded with him. Mark asked what's going on. The woman waved her hand for her companions to come closer and revealed there were more than 10 of them. They paid an agent to smuggle them, but if the captain doesn't know him, he might report them, and no one will know if they die here. The woman begs him to let them out. Mark replied he didn't have that authority. The woman insisted there's a monster here that comes every so often and eats one of them. Peering inside, Mark saw a gruesomely mutilated body being pulled out by the woman's companions, shocking him. Initially, Mark wanted to report this to the captain, but knowing the captain's insistence on reporting issues through the chain of command, so he hesitated. Given his recent clash with the supervisor, Mark decided to take matters into his own hands. He returned to the container and started using a gas cutter to open it. The woman urged him to hurry up and called out that the monster was coming. As Mark pried open the container, the supervisor approached with an axe, shouting for him to keep quiet. He attacked Mark, revealing his involvement in the smuggling operation. The two struggled, and then the captain arrived, armed with a gun, demanding an explanation. Mark seized the opportunity to reveal to the captain that there were stowaways in the containers, and he suspected the supervisor was involved. And there's something more, a monster in there. The captain asked the supervisor if he took the money. The supervisor handed cash to the captain, revealing their collaboration. The captain then scolded Mark. The captain and supervisor pinned Mark's head against the container opening. As they restrained him, the captain said Mark was too trusting because these people were criminals, and they were just delivering them to Europe. There's no monster. If they were starving, it's because they were turning on each other. In the end, Mark was killed. The 24th story begins with a woman named Sydney visiting her psychologist again. The doctor patiently explained to her that she had a dissociative identity disorder, but with the help of hypnotherapy, they could treat it. By entering a hypnotic state, she could communicate with her other personalities and try to eliminate them, thus resolving the issue. As the psychologist spoke, they turned on a flickering light, and Sydney nodded in rhythm with the light. In an instant, Sydney found herself in a dreamscape. Rather than a hallucination, it was a representation of Sydney's mental state. The enclosed spaces and different colored lights reflected the harm caused by her family and the setbacks she had faced growing up. Encouraged by the psychologist's words, Sydney opened the innermost door and met a personality named Charles, who often troubled her. She pleaded with him to stop harassing her. Charles was tormented by Sydney's voice, clutching his ears in pain. The scene shifted, and Sydney awoke from hypnosis, feeling elated that she had removed that personality. On a map of her mind that she had drawn with the doctor, Sydney marked an X over Charles's location. The psychologist responded that they should leave it at that for now, and asked her to come back if she encountered any issues. On her way home, Sydney was harassed by some teenagers who hurled insults at her. Once home, she started preparing a meal, but felt another personality take control, compelling her to grab a knife and attempt suicide. Fortunately, she snapped out of it just in time. Without delay, Sydney returned to the psychologist, realizing the problem wasn't resolved. Seeing the urgency, the psychologist decided to perform another hypnotherapy session. As the flickering lights transported her back into her mental landscape, the psychologist encouraged Sydney to confront her fears and face another personality. However, this time Sydney struggled. She not only saw her 10-year-old self filled with despair, but also her most hated person, her father. When she was 10, he had murdered her mother. Overwhelmed, Sydney awoke from hypnosis and left the psychologist's office. On her way home, she encountered the same teenagers who had harassed her earlier. Though she outwardly ignored them, she followed them and attacked them from behind with a brick. It seemed her deep-seated resentment toward men had reached its peak. Back at home, Sydney seemed like a different person. She burned her beloved art books and personal items. Re-entering her mental landscape, Sydney engaged in a conversation with her younger self, talking to her with a resolute smile. Reflecting on the pain she had suffered as a child, Sydney ultimately found peace and reconciled with herself. When the psychologist visited Sydney's home later, they were surprised by her voice, which had changed significantly. It now resembled that of her 10-year-old self. Sydney smiled and explained that she had finally said goodbye to her past self. The 25th story begins with a psychiatrist driving to a mental hospital to visit a patient named Martin. Upon sitting down with him, the doctor noticed Martin's fingers opening and closing in a regular pattern over a piece of paper, with repetitions ranging from 3 to 5 times. The doctor asked if this was some kind of OCD ritual, but Martin denied it, claiming he was just playing around. Despite his words, Martin's hands shook, itching to continue the action. The doctor suspected Martin was indeed suffering from obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. The psychiatrist reassured Martin that this was normal and asked him when this behavior started. Initially, it seemed like a typical OCD case where the doctor might prescribe medication or suggest some behavioral therapy. However, as Martin recounted his story, the doctor realized it was more peculiar than expected. Martin explained that since he was a child, he had experienced compulsive behaviors or ritualistic actions. Others might not understand, but he believed completing these actions would keep his family safe. Every day, he performed these rituals, like tugging his ears, despite the discomfort. He believed breaking these rituals would lead to disaster. Martin vividly recalled being 7 years old, walking step by step in front of his house to complete a ritual, usually 20 steps in total. While doing this, a classmate suddenly shouted at him from a bicycle. Martin's step faltered, breaking his stride. Normally, he would finish the action, but irritated by the classmate calling him a freak, he broke the routine, stepping off the path. As a result, he witnessed the classmate being hit by a car. The psychiatrist commented that it might have been a coincidence and his classmate might not have been paying attention. Martin didn't argue but continued his story, saying his broken marriage and family weren't important. After all, his wife and child leaving him meant they could live safely. Martin then recounted his last job. One day at noon, he received a signal to perform a certain behavior. As he was tapping his ears and picking up a pen, his boss walked in. To ease the awkwardness, Martin explained he had finished his work and was just picking up a dropped pen. He thought he had deflected the situation, but the boss insisted on lunching together. With 5 more repetitions of the action needed, the boss assured him it could wait. Despite outwardly following his boss, Martin knew deep down that his incomplete routine would lead to disaster. He made an excuse about forgetting his wallet and tried to return to his office to finish the ritual. As the boss stepped out, the elevator malfunctioned during repairs, and the boss fell to his death in the shaft. After that incident, Martin distanced himself from everyone, avoiding bringing harm to others. He confessed to the psychiatrist that he now spent hours each day performing these compulsions. It's like a contract with God, and he had to do these things for the world to run normally. The psychiatrist asked when he got these signals from God. Martin replied he sensed them through sights and sounds, like how many times to do an action. Objects around him provide the answers. Frustrated by the doctor's questioning, which seemed dismissive, Martin grew agitated, saying he didn't know why he was chosen, but it's true. When the psychiatrist prescribed some medication, Martin became more upset, trying to act out. Security intervened, restraining Martin, and the psychiatrist administered a sedative before leaving. To the psychiatrist, Martin's story was bizarre, but still seemed like a typical OCD case requiring standard treatment. However, upon exiting the hospital, the psychiatrist wondered if it was the apocalypse. Reaching the parking lot, they found their car overturned. A security guard approached, bizarrely telling him not to worry since he's the next, before shooting the person inside the car. Firefighters arrived, but inexplicably used flamethrowers on the vehicles instead of helping. As the psychiatrist ran back, they saw chaos, people committing suicide, crimes rampant. Despite no typhoon, fish rained from the sky. With nowhere else to go, they returned to the hospital, finding a nurse who had hanged herself. This all suggests that Martin's warnings might be true. Desperate, the psychiatrist sought Martin, asking what's going on outside was madness and his wife was on a plane. He then asked him if he had any signals from God on how to fix this and if he was doing this right. The psychiatrist then tapped his shoulder 3 times, then once below. Just then, the phone rang. It was the psychiatrist's wife, reporting a terrifying but safe landing after turbulence. Relieved, the psychiatrist wondered if his actions had saved her. Ready to leave, Martin stopped them, saying the psychiatrist had signed God's contract now. The 26th story begins with Lisa, a deaf and mute woman who is also an artist. One day, while watching a courtroom trial, she followed along with the live broadcast subtitles and the visuals, sketching the trial's proceedings. Initially, she thought it was just a routine case. Suddenly, Lisa heard the words bleeding shouted at her from within her mind. Since she had never heard sounds before, this frightened her. During a break in the trial, she accidentally overheard the inner thoughts of a nearby detective, which were full of conflict and turmoil. Lisa dismissed them at first. When the trial resumed in the afternoon, she watched as the detective took an oath and began testifying from the witness stand. While sketching, Lisa listened to his internal monologue, noting down key phrases on her drawing. She realized that the defendant was neither a drug dealer nor a murderer. The detective had planted fingerprints on the gun and framed him. This explained the detective's earlier anxiety and why the defendant fervently defended himself, saying that he never even touched the gun, let alone killed anyone. After the trial concluded that day, Lisa cautiously left the courthouse with her sketches. However, she accidentally dropped her drawings and a passerby helped her pick them up. Looking up, she realized it was the detective who saw the annotations on her drawings. Trying to cover up her notes, Lisa quickly made her escape. That night, she once again heard his inner thoughts. Looking out the window, she noticed the detective was now following her. After deliberating all night, Lisa went to the courthouse the next morning and found the defense attorney. She tried to communicate, saying that the detective is the real culprit and he framed his client. Although her speech was unclear, the attorney understood Lisa's message. He gave her photographs from the crime scene and asked her to find evidence. Comparing the photos with her annotated sketches, Lisa deduced that there might be flaws in the detective's frame-up on the bus and that some incriminating evidence could still be there. That evening, Lisa went to the bus involved in the incident and found a bag of illicit money under a seat, likely left by the detective to avoid detection. Suddenly, she heard his inner voice saying he needed to eliminate this girl. Knowing the detective was onto her again, Lisa used the opportunity to evade him, fleeing to an abandoned factory, but the factory's limited space left her cornered. The detective caught Lisa, pinned her heavy body against the wall, and demanded to know how she knew all of this. Unable to speak clearly, Lisa only heard the detective's inner thoughts throughout. As Lisa struggled to explain, she suddenly heard the detective reminiscing about his childhood with his brother. She repeated the information aloud, saying he had a brother named Tim, and when he was little, he and Tim were out shopping and got caught in a gang fight. In the chaos, his brother was hit and killed. That's why you became a detective, since he hated gangsters. Now, the defendant in court is a gangster, so he framed him. She claimed that his brother's death wasn't his fault, and it's not too late to do the right thing. The detective, stunned, realized that no one had ever known about his brother's story, which he had never shared. Moved, he fell to his knees and thanked Lisa for understanding his thoughts. In the end, the detective turned himself in to his police colleagues. And so the story concludes.